What was it like to hear those songs that you worked on being played for you?
Well, I've heard them so many times.
Yeah.
I mean, especially by him. I mean, I've been to many of his gigs, and it's how it is. It doesn't get in my way.
Yeah.
Stop scrolling for just a second, because what I'm about to tell you, most Beatles fans have never actually heard this. Ringo Starr, the quiet one, the funny one, the one everyone just assumed was perfectly happy tapping away on his drums, while John, Paul and George got all the glory. Yeah, that guy, he walked out. He actually quit the Beatles, mid-album, packed his bags, said nothing to the press and disappeared. And the reason he left? It wasn't drugs, it wasn't money, it wasn't Yoko. It was something so deeply human, so painfully relatable, that when you hear it, you're going to feel it in your chest. Because we've all been that person in the room, the one who smiles through it all, while quietly wondering, do these people even want me here? Stick around, because this is the real story of Ringo Starr. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to see him completely differently. Now, to understand where Ringo ended up, you have to understand where he started. And that beginning, it was not glamorous. Richard Starkey, yeah, that's his actual name, was born in 1940 in the Dingle. And if you don't know Liverpool geography, just know that the Dingle was not exactly the posh part of town. It was a tough, working-class neighborhood. And Ringo's childhood was tough to match. He spent years in and out of hospitals as a kid. Appendicitis at 6, a burst appendix, complications. He was in and out of beds and wards for so long that he missed entire stretches of school. He could barely read properly for years. He wasn't athletic. He wasn't the class clown. He was just this quiet, sick kid from a rough neighborhood who nobody expected much from. And then he found drums. Now here's the thing about Ringo that most people miss. He didn't just happen to be decent at drums. The guy was genuinely, ridiculously good. But Liverpool in the early 60s was absolutely stacked with talented musicians. Ringo was already making a name for himself with a band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, which, honestly, was one of the most popular acts in the whole Merseyside scene at the time. So when Brian Epstein called him in 1962 and said, "We want you in the Beatles," Ringo didn't fall over himself with excitement. In fact, and I love this, he told Epstein he couldn't start that night because he had a prior gig. He said he'd start on Saturday. The man had standards, even then. But here's where it gets interesting, and where we need to talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. The first wound, Love Me Do. Most people think Ringo joined the Beatles and everything was sunshine and Beatlemania from day one. But that is not what happened. Almost immediately after he joined the band, Ringo was sidelined for one of their first proper recording sessions. Their producer at the time, George Martin, wasn't fully convinced that Ringo was the right fit. He wasn't sure about the new guy. So for the recording of Love Me Do, one of their very first singles, Martin brought in a session drummer named Andy White. Andy White played drums on the track. Ringo played the tambourine. Let that sink in for a second. You've just joined possibly the most exciting young band in England. You've replaced someone, Pete Best, which already has half of Liverpool hating your guts. And then you show up to the recording studio and they hand you a tambourine. Can you imagine how that must have felt? And here's the thing, Ringo never made a scene about it. He didn't storm out, didn't throw a fit. He shook that tambourine and kept his mouth shut, because that's who Ringo Starr is. He's the guy who absorbs. But absorbing things, quietly, over and over again, has a limit. And that limit was coming. The golden years, before it all fell apart. Now, let's be fair. For a good while, things were genuinely magical. Beatlemania was real. It was electric. And by all accounts, those four lads genuinely liked each other. They were road warriors together. They'd been crammed into vans, played sweaty clubs in Hamburg, shared bad meals and worse hotel rooms.
There was a real bond there, a brotherhood. And Ringo, despite being the last to join, was absolutely part of it. John Lennon, in particular, had a warm spot for Ringo. They had a similar sense of humor. Dry, absurd, a little dark. They got each other. Paul always got on with Ringo too, at least on the surface. George Harrison, who also came in a bit younger than the other two, always seemed to have a genuine fondness for Ringo that never really faded. But then, the touring stopped. In 1966, the Beatles played their last live concert. And without the shared experience of being on the road, something shifted. Because when you're not out there together, surviving the madness of fame side by side, you go back to being individuals. You go back to your own habits, your own relationships, your own ideas. And the cracks started to show. Here's something I want you to sit with for a moment. Brian Epstein, their manager, their protector, the man who arguably believed in them before anyone else did, died in August 1967. He was 32 years old. Drug overdose. Accidental. And the effect on the Beatles was devastating in ways that took years to fully understand. Epstein wasn't just their business manager. He was the adult in the room. He was the one who kept the peace. He handled the money, he handled the contracts, he handled the people. He knew how to talk to each of them differently. He was a buffer between four massive personalities. When he died, that buffer was gone. And what filled the space? Paul McCartney. Now, Paul stepped up with the best intentions. He genuinely wanted to keep the band moving forward. But here's the thing about Paul McCartney. The man is a perfectionist. A controlling perfectionist. And when you're that driven, that focused, that certain of your own vision, it can be inspiring. It can also be absolutely suffocating. Ringo, to his credit, has never been bitter about it publicly. But in interviews over the decades, he's been quietly honest. He's talked about how Paul would sometimes demonstrate exactly how he wanted the drum parts played. Sometimes he'd sit down at Ringo's own drum kit and show him the beat. As if Ringo, one of the most instinctive drummers in rock history, needed to be taught how to hit things. Now, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Drop an answer in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you were good at something, really good, and someone kept second-guessing you anyway? Maybe a boss, a partner, a parent? Because I think a lot of us know exactly how that feels. And for Ringo, that feeling built and built and built, until it exploded in the summer of 1968. The Beatles went into Abbey Road to record what would become one of the greatest double albums in history, The Beatles, or as everyone calls it, the White Album. 30 songs, massive in scope, and it was a nightmare to make. By this point, John had Yoko Ono with him in the studio constantly. George was chafing under Paul's dominance over the songwriting. Paul was running sessions with military precision, and Ringo was just there, trying to keep his head down and do his job. But here's the moment that changes everything. On August 22, 1968, Ringo Starr walked into the studio, picked up his sticks, and then put them down again. He went to Paul and said he was leaving. He said he didn't feel like he was playing well. He said he felt like an outsider. He said he felt unloved. And then, and this part is just crushing to me, he went to John's place. He knocked on the door. He told John exactly how he was feeling. That he felt like the other three were really close and that he was on the outside looking in. And John Lennon looked at him and said, "I thought it was you three." They all felt it. Every single one of them felt isolated. Every one of them thought the other three had a secret bond that excluded him. It's almost darkly comedic in a way. Four of the most famous people on Earth, each one quietly convinced he was the lonely one. Ringo left. He took a vacation to Sardinia with his friend, comedian Peter Sellers. While he was gone, the other three recorded without him, and Back in the USSR was laid down, with all three of them taking turns on the drum kit. Now back here at Hidden Fame Files, we dig into these kinds of moments, the ones that never quite made the history books, but tell you everything about what was really going on. And if you're finding this kind of story as fascinating as I am, honestly, hit that subscribe button and stick around. We've got a whole library of stories like this that you're not going to find anywhere else. 2 weeks later, Ringo came back. The band had reached out. They wanted him back. And when he walked into Abbey Road, something beautiful happened. George Harrison had covered his entire drum kit in flowers, a proper welcome home, from George, who, in his own quiet way, understood exactly what it meant to feel underestimated. And the band, as a peace offering of sorts, agreed to record a song that Ringo had written during his time away. A silly, joyful, utterly charming little song about life under the sea, Octopus's Garden. Now look, musically, it's not a day in the life. It's not Strawberry Fields. But you know what? Every time that song comes on, people smile. Children smile. Adults who haven't smiled in days, they smile. And Ringo wrote that. He wrote it sitting on a boat in Sardinia after the worst professional experience of his life, and it became one of the most beloved songs in the entire Beatles catalog. That tells you something about who this man is. Actually, real quick, if you're watching this on YouTube and you see the height button below the video, go ahead and tap it. It's YouTube's newer feature that basically tells the algorithm this video is worth spreading around. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the real Ringo Starr, stories that actually matter, then hype it up. It genuinely helps us get this content out to more people who'd appreciate it. Okay, back to where things get really messy. So after all of this, after the White Album, after the tensions, after Let It Be was recorded in an atmosphere described by multiple people present as deeply uncomfortable, along came a man named Alan Klein. Klein was a music industry manager, sharp, aggressive, and very, very good at finding leverage. He swooped in at the exact moment the Beatles were most vulnerable, right after Brian Epstein's death left them without anyone steering the ship, and he knew exactly how to work the room. John loved him. Alan Klein had this working-class chip on his shoulder, this hustler energy that resonated deeply with Lennon. Klein talked tough. He made big promises. He seemed like the kind of guy who'd fight for you. John was in. George followed. Ringo, always the loyal one, always not wanting to rock the boat, went along. Paul wanted nothing to do with Klein. Paul was already in a relationship with Linda Eastman, and her father and brother were lawyers, respectable entertainment lawyers. Paul wanted Lee Eastman to manage the band's business. He was outvoted 3-1. And that vote, that single decision, was arguably the moment the Beatles stopped being a band and started being a legal dispute. Klein's approach to management was to get between people, divide, stir rivalries, John against Paul, business against creativity. He encouraged the idea that certain members were being taken advantage of more than others. He pushed the idea that Paul was the problem. And slowly, the four of them stopped being a team. Here's something to think about, and I'd love to hear your take in the comments. Do you think bands, or any creative partnership really, can survive business betrayal? Or is money always the thing that kills what people built together? Because I think about this a lot. These four guys wrote Hey Jude together. They wrote Yesterday. And in the end, what tore them apart wasn't music, it was contracts. Now I know what some of you are thinking. What about Yoko? And look, that is a complicated conversation that we could do a whole separate video on. But here's what's fair to say. John Lennon, by 1968, was going through a profound personal transformation. He was questioning everything, his identity, his marriage, his art, his whole place in the world. And when he met Yoko Ono, she became central to all of that questioning. Yoko's presence in the studio was constant, and that changed the dynamic in a very fundamental way. The studio, Abbey Road, had always been a kind of private space, a creative sanctuary just for the four of them and their team. When a fifth person was suddenly present at every session, sitting right next to John, whispering in his ear, offering opinions on takes and mixes, it changed things.
Ringo never publicly attacked Yoko. That's important to note. He's remained gracious. But in various interviews over the years, he's acknowledged that the arrival of partners, not just Yoko, but Linda for Paul and Patty for George, changed the internal chemistry. The band became couples, not brothers, and that's a very different thing. The breakup and the bitterness. By 1970, it was over. Paul issued a press statement effectively announcing he was leaving the band, which ironically made him look like the one who pulled the trigger, even though the fractures had been building for years. John was furious about how it was handled. Legal battles erupted. Alan Klein was eventually sued by all four of them at various points, which tells you everything you need to know about how that relationship ended. Ringo, through all of it, remained the most diplomatic. He genuinely tried to stay close with all three of his former bandmates. He appeared on albums for John, for George, for Paul. He maintained relationships across the battle lines in ways that took real emotional intelligence. But internally, he was hurting. He'd given his 20s to this band. He'd pushed through the insecurities, the sidelines, the second-guessing, and in the end it dissolved into lawyers and press statements and people who used to be brothers not speaking to each other for years. And Ringo? Ringo had to figure out who he was without the Beatles, which is its own kind of lonely. The legacy, the heartbeat that held it together. Here's the thing that I want to make sure lands properly, because this is the whole point. For decades, Ringo Starr was dismissed. He was lucky. Any drummer could have done what he did. He was the weakest link. You've heard it. If you're in this age group, you've probably said it at some point, even jokingly. But here's what the musicians know. Here's what the people who actually played with Ringo say, over and over. Paul McCartney, at the 2015 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony, when he inducted Ringo as a solo artist, said something that I think finally put this debate to rest. He talked about watching other bands and how musicians constantly have to glance back at their drummer, nervous about tempo. Too fast, too slow, drifting. It's a constant anxiety. And then he said something like, when Ringo is behind you, you never have to look. You just play, because he is steady. He is the foundation. Ringo's drumming on Come Together, on Ticket to Ride, on Rain, which is genuinely considered one of the greatest drum performances in rock history, full stop. These aren't the performances of a lucky stand-in. These are the performances of a genius who made everything look effortless. And that's the cruelest kind of talent, isn't it? The kind that looks so natural, so unforced, that people assume anyone could do it. Nobody else could do what Ringo did. Nobody. Reconciliation, the ending that feels like grace. Now let's talk about how this story ends, because the ending actually matters. In 2015, Paul McCartney personally made it his mission to get Ringo inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Ringo was the last Beatle to receive that individual recognition, which, by the way, is an absolute scandal that it took that long. But Paul didn't just campaign for it quietly. He called Dave Grohl, he called Bruce Springsteen, he built a coalition. He said, I will personally do the induction. And on that stage, in Cleveland, Paul stood up and introduced his old bandmate. He told stories about the first time Ringo played with them, how he just absolutely nailed it, and how the three of them looked at each other with this expression of pure shock and joy. He said that was the real beginning of the Beatles, not the songs, not the contracts. That one moment when Ringo sat down and started to play. Ringo took the stage and gave a speech that was warm and funny and a little bit roguish, classic Ringo. And in that room, with all that history between them, the fights, the lawyers, the years of silence, the grief over John and George, there was something that looked a lot like forgiveness. Or maybe recognition, a return to what they actually were before all the noise. Two men who had made something extraordinary together, standing in the same room again, and finally saying so out loud. Close, the real answer. So who did Ringo Starr truly hate the most? I think that headline, and I know we led with it, is a little bit misleading. Because here's what I actually believe after all of this. Ringo Starr didn't hate anyone. What he hated was the feeling of being invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to see him. He hated being overlooked, being second-guessed, being treated like the lucky one who should just be grateful he got a seat at the table. He hated what the Beatles became at the end. Not the band, but the machine. The business, the ego battles, the moment when four people who used to finish each other's sentences started sending lawyers to communicate. And maybe, just maybe, for a long time, he hated how little credit he got for holding the whole thing together. Because that's what Ringo did. Every session, every take, every album, he was the foundation, the steady pulse underneath the chaos. While John was reinventing himself and Paul was controlling every detail, and George was quietly building towards something great, Ringo just played, beautifully, consistently, without applause. And here's the thing about people like that. The world tends to notice them last, but when they're gone, you feel it. Final CTA. If this video made you think about Ringo differently, even just a little, do me a favor, leave a comment below, tell me. Who do you think was the real heart of the Beatles? Was it John? Paul? Was it Ringo all along? I genuinely read the comments, and I love hearing what you all think about this stuff. And if you made it to the end of this video, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Hidden Fame Files is all about these stories. The ones hiding right underneath the surface of the history we all think we know. People who were essential and underestimated. Moments that changed everything but never made the headlines. Hit that subscribe button, and I mean actually hit it, not just think about hitting it, because we've got more stories like this one coming. Stories about George Harrison's quiet rage, about what really happened during the Let It Be sessions, about the women who shaped these men and never got a single credit. The real story of the Beatles is just getting started. I'll see you in the next one.